Good afternoon, welcome to FIU. It's entirely appropriate that we gather this afternoon on the eve of the Summit of the Americas to have this critical conversation about two countries and their relationship, two countries with which our country and our community are intimately linked, Cuba and Venezuela. There's an interdependence between these two countries that perhaps one would have not predicted had it not been for decisions made through the respective leaders of those countries. And that interdependence is clearly having a major impact on the shape of hemispheric affairs. What better place to discuss those issues than right here at FIU? FIU, an institution that is blessed to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Venezuelan students and thousands of Cuban and Cuban American students, and two programs that focus their efforts on these critical partners of ours, namely the Cuban Research Institute and the Latin American and Caribbean Center. And I'm particularly proud this afternoon to welcome my colleagues who are going to speak with you soon. Carlos Romero, Javier Corrales, Manuel Gomez will be here, and Maria Werlau. I'm so grateful that they could be here with us in this critical conversation, in particular to welcome Carlos, with whom I've worked for maybe almost 4 decades in one fashion or the other when we were together at the University of Pittsburgh. But today is a conversation that will certainly inform your understanding of what's likely to happen over the next couple of days at that summit, and more importantly, what's likely to happen over the next couple months and years as it relates to this triangulated relationship that we have with these two critical countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you. I want to thank you for being here, and I'm looking forward to a really great conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenberg. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Frank Mora to address the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Jorge. It's really delightful to be able to once again collaborate with you and the Cuban Research Institute. This is, as the President indicated, a very timely event, right? Not only just a few days from the summit, but in light also of the President's executive order sanctioning 7 individuals in Venezuela, in the Venezuelan government for corruption and human rights. We always do things in a timely way here at FIU. I'm also very happy to see so many students here today. Cuban students, Venezuelan students, and other students here to listen to this really excellent panel that Jorge has put together once again. And Jorge, again, thank you for the opportunity and to collaborate with you. We will continue this important collaboration, and we'll be doing things in a timely fashion as we always do. Thank you again, Jorge. Thank you all for being here.
So now, without further ado, I'd like to briefly introduce our panel, which, as both presenters have mentioned, is really a very distinguished panel, both on Cuba and Venezuela. Our first speaker will be Dr. Carlos Antonio Romero Mendez, who is a retired professor and researcher at the Institute of Political Studies at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. He previously served as director of the Center for Graduate Studies at the College of Legal and Political Studies at the same university. He earned his PhD in political science at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, his MA in political science at the University of Pittsburgh, and his BA in Political and Administrative Studies at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. He's the author or co-author of 23 books and more than 100 academic articles specializing on Venezuela and the Caribbean Basin. His most recent book publication is titled US Venezuelan Relations since the 1990s, Coping with Mid-Level Security Threats, published in 2013, co-authored with Javier Corrales. And I understand also they have more publications coming up. Our second speaker will be precisely Javier Corrales, who is the Dwight W. Morrow 1895 professor and chair of political science at Amherst College. He earned his PhD in political science at Harvard University and his BS in foreign service from Georgetown University. Dr. Corrales' research focuses on the organization and the political economy of development, particularly in Venezuela, Cuba, and Argentina. He is the co-author of the book that I mentioned before, but also of two additional works that are relevant to this conference: The Promise of Participation, Experiments in Participatory Governance in Honduras and Guatemala, published in 2013, and more pertinent to this topic, Dragon in the Tropics, Hugo Chávez and the Political Economy of Revolution in Venezuela, published in 2011. And we just had our fourth member of the panel arrive just in time, Professor Manuel Gomez, who is an associate professor of law here at FIU. Starting this month, Professor Gomez will also serve as Associate Dean of International and Graduate Studies at the FIU College of Law. He holds dual law degrees from Stanford University and the Universidad Católica Andrés Bello in Caracas. Professor Gomez's research and teaching and writing focus on dispute resolution and governance, legal and institutional reform in Latin America, the globalization of the legal profession, and innovations in legal education. His work has been published in leading academic journals in the field of law. And finally, we'll have Ms. Maria Huerlao, the Executive Director and Co-founder of Cuba Archive. This is an initiative of Free Society, a nonprofit organization devoted to promoting human rights through research and scholarship. She's also an independent consultant and policy analyst, as well as the author of numerous articles on a wide range of Cuban affairs. Formerly a second vice president of the Change Manhattan Bank, Ms. Huerlao holds a bachelor's degree in foreign service from Georgetown University and a master in international relations from the Universidad de Chile. She's a member of the board of directors of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Romero to begin his talk.
Thank you, Jorge. Thank you for everything. The relation between Caracas and Havana may be summarized in three common trends. First, most of the analysis support the idea that the alliance between the two countries is mainly due to the friendship between Hugo Chávez and Fidel Castro. It is considered as a particular situation in which the Cuban leader opted for supporting a lefty leader who made his way in national and regional politics. In the second place stands the argument that the current Venezuelan crisis has forced Cuba to diversify its diplomatic, economic, and trade relations with other countries in order to avoid a critical situation such as what happened with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Thirdly, it is discussed that Cuba, in its negotiation for the normalization of relations with the United States, has betrayed the Chavista project. Regarding the first argument, our basic and different assumption is that the Castro regime's main objective from the beginning of the Cuban Revolution was to support leftist groups who advocate a revolutionary change in Venezuela through both legal policies and armed struggle. Since 1992, Fidel Castro and the Cuban regime strongly support Chávez's political project, but within the framework of the historical relationship between the Venezuelan left and the Cuban Revolution. Ever since the triumph of revolution in 1959, both the Cuban government and the rest of the political movement in the Cuban Revolution wove an association with the Venezuelan left. Although it happened in almost all the global and regional revolutionary movements, the case of Venezuela was more important. Many Venezuelans were periodically in Cuba for over more than 30 years, participating in military training, logistical support, and ideological training. Some of them even joined the armed forces of Cuba, and others participate in international and Cuban military missions abroad. It is enough historical evidence, thus, of Cuba's intervention in Venezuela's internal politics. In addition to that, Cuba was a permanent issue both in Venezuelan foreign policy as an internal politics of the country before Chávez came to power. It must be noted that Chávez came into power supported by a political platform where a large group of political leaders and party cadres of the Venezuelan left considered the Cuban Revolution as a model to follow, ranging from the military insurrection, including urban and rural guerrillas, to electoral participation. While Hugo Chávez had not had a direct link with Havana because of his age and his military profession, he had an indirect relationship after the two military coups attempts against President Carlos Andrés Pérez in 1992, and later during the time in prison, through civilian politicians that had that historical context with Cuba. Regarding the second issue, it is clear that while Venezuela became Cuba's main ally since 1999, Havana never ceased to diversify its political, economic, and trade relations with other major countries in order to achieve their goals. First of all, from the beginning of the 21st century, Cuba maintained good relations with countries like China and Canada, which contribute to prevent the collapse of the Cuban economy, which had not been predicted after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Cuba also maintained several links with moderate countries in Latin America and some members of the European Union, as is the case of France and Spain. Likewise, it continued relations with some African countries, such as Algeria and Angola. And for the third issue, the new and optimistic hemispheric dimension is based on a stronger relation between the United States, not only with Cuba, but also with Bolivia, Ecuador, and Uruguay, but by managing to achieve a modus vivendi with Washington. However, we cannot assume that this means the total displacement of Venezuela in Cuba priorities, as the recent Washington-Caracas political crisis has shown. In our view, the relation between Caracas and Havana is stable, and the level of conflict between Caracas and Washington is most all related to the characteristics of a government that make imperialism his leitmotif. Likewise, Washington has focused on criticism of Venezuelan domestic situation, referring especially to the state of human rights of the country and the reduction of democratic goals. If the government and the ruling sectors continue to promote the deepening of radicalism, the exclusion of the democratic sectors, the lack of guarantees in the electoral system, and the control of the media, both the US as well as Latin American and European countries will continue to insist on the need to seek a democratic balance in Venezuela. Venezuela, don't forget, is a country with a revisionist foreign policy, and therefore it doesn't have the same perceptions that the US and his allies has about the characteristics of the external threats. The recent developments, which has opened the possibility for the normalization of relations between the US and Cuba, pose the question on how they will impact on relations between Caracas and Washington. Following the announcement of the normalization process between the US and Cuba last November, Cuba's clear endorsement of Venezuela dispelled any doubts about some analysts that had raised regarding a possible distancing between Caracas and Havana. Indeed, Cuba has observed with caution the Venezuelan political crisis that began in February 2014. From a general point of view, it is considered that the special relationship could be highly harmed by a regime change in Venezuela that would impact on the external relations of the Cuban Revolution and the island's economy. It is not the first time in which Cuba experienced a close ally in problems in Latin America and the Caribbean, but perhaps Venezuela is the biggest and the most consequential given the time elapsed and the deepening of those links. The Cuban revolutionary experience in Latin America and the Caribbean has been fraught with difficulties, with many years of activism, both in terms of the guerrilla warfare and other political ways, such as linked to the special relationship held with friendly governments. Let me take the most significant cases: Chile, Grenada, and Nicaragua. Cuba opted for the socialist orientation of these three governments allies in specific situations. Chile under the Popular Unity government of Salvador Allende from 1970 to 1973. The spirit of the New Deal in Grenada under the leadership of Maurice Bishop from 1979 to 1983, and the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua since 1979 to 1990. Cuba developed very close ideological, political, and economic relations with each of those governments, but Havana was not able to prevent the overthrow and their collapse. The first was done by military coup, the second by dividing the revolutionary leadership, and a power vacuum, and the subsequent US invasion, and the third by an electoral defeat. Those examples and other Cuban experiences in Africa became lessons to be learned and analyzed. From the Chilean experience, Cuba learned that the armed forces must be controlled and socialized in favor of the regime. From the Grenadian case, that nobody had to encourage internal fraction in the leadership. And finally, no one should make choices in adverse political situation, as was the case in Nicaragua in 1990. In this last case, we have to remind the presence of the opposing military insurrection of the Contras, the negative economic situation, the open confrontation with the US government, and the unfavorable global situation due to the disappearance of the Soviet Union and the isolation of Cuba. In this time of winds of change in Venezuela, Havana has turned on the alarm as it happened in 2002, following the overthrow by few hours of President Hugo Chávez, and where Fidel Castro played a key role to the return of the presidency of Venezuela of Hugo Chávez. Cuba's government has paid more attention to the Venezuelan case recently, openly supporting President Maduro, the United of the Revolutionary Movement, deepened military cooperation, full support and absolute control of the armed forces, not calling election in advance, and looking for international support and solidarity. Hence, it is important to emphasize the word of Raúl Castro when he refers recently to the Venezuela situation as a complex, given the impact of the death of President Hugo Chávez, the difficult process of transition of power in Venezuela as a result of the disease and the death of Hugo Chávez, the result of the presidential election in April 2013 by Nicolás Maduro, who won with a narrow margin, the deteriorating economic and social situation, the importance of the political opposition process, and the avalanche of negative perceptions on the Bolivarian revolution made by some governments, multilateral agencies, NGOs, media, academia, and social networks. Decisions of Washington and Havana are an important juncture for both governments but it also impacts on the hemispheric relations and their own societies. From a regional perspective, what stands out is the fact that Cuba has shared the interest above its alliance with Venezuela, whose government is a continual conflict with the United States. Cuba has been for more than a decade the main strategic ally of Venezuela. Broadcast television and radio in Havana during the last stage of the life of President Chávez demonstrate the veracity of his claim in 2007 when Chávez said that Cuba and Venezuela were one nation. Similarly, in a post-electoral interview, Nicolás Maduro called the relation between Fidel Castro and Hugo Chávez as a father and son, and the former Cuban president, talking about Fidel, referred as a living legend of the struggle for independence and freedom of the country. There are about 40,000 Cubans in Venezuela, most of them in healthcare and education. Also, the safety and health of the late President Chávez were in hands of the Cubans. Both countries signed several agreements on social programs and formed the backbone for ALBA. In 2012, both governments developed more than 50 cooperation projects, which mean around 2,000 million. Venezuelan offset the cost of sending Cuban advice and 100,000 barrels of oil per day. But Venezuela energy supply to Cuba only partially ensures the economic survival of the Castro regime. We must also take into account the payment of about 2,500 for every Cuban who is in Venezuela doing several activities into the Chávez government and now under Maduro. Venezuela is the first trading partner of Havana. Maduro presidency has been the continuation of the special bilateral alliance between Caracas and Havana. In fact, Cuba still continues to receive payments for its advantageous cooperation agreements under favorable conditions. The key issue is to see for how long. In fact, Cuban statistics of 2013 show a fall of around 21% less trade if you compare with 2012. In the commercial relationship with Venezuela and Cuba, must be another sharp drop in 2015. Any initiative of this nature must be based on the discussion of scenarios projected in the coming months. First scenario, the downward trend in oil prices and a general crisis of the Venezuelan economic continues, which in turn drives a state of social dissatisfaction and political protest that make the government to implement a severe economic adjustment plan, which in turn generates the exponential growth of the informal economy in Venezuela. On the political front, the government is far from to reach any possibility of dialogue with the opposition and deepen the authoritarian and exclusionary mood. At the same time, the international criticism of government, congressmen, media, academia, individuals, and non-governmental organizations on the dangers of the rule of law in Venezuela arise. Cuba, in this case, will close ranks with Venezuela and defend the Chávez regime, but at a high cost. Second scenario. The above is composed and begin to open cracks in the power base of the Chávez regime. Military pressure, a division of leadership and social protest from Chávez militants appear causing a state of helplessness that leads to the public to call for a state of emergency, followed by an internal military intervention, against the regime. The new government broke off relations with Cuba. The shipment of Venezuelan barrels of subsidized oil to Cuba will be suspended and begin to return home of the Cuban collaborators. Third scenario. The elements of the first and second scenarios are exacerbated, causing a scenario of political dissolution. This allows the international community to promote a transition made by a joint task force by members of the regime and the opposition. The government of Cuba, in this case, will have a moderate and passive behavior if that situation will happen. Of course, these scenarios are not necessarily feasible and they can be combined. In fact, other circumstances may cause other scenarios. For example, that after a parliamentary election scheduled for this year, the opposition will win, and a new kind of cohabitation between the government and the opposition will begin. In any case, both political and bilateral economic relations could be affected. Venezuela has reduced oil supplies to several countries in Central America and the Caribbean, or the conditions have changed. As the price of Venezuelan oil is now around $45 per barrel and production has fallen in the country, it is very difficult to supply 100,000 barrels of oil a day to Cuba. Venezuela has postponed some projects, and it is known now for 2 years which is the direct investment of Venezuela in Cuba. The rearrangement of relations between Washington and Havana has an important impact in Venezuela. Nicolás Maduro government is far behind of the rest of the hemisphere in the antagonistic mood to avoid to negotiate with the United States, and blames the Yankees for all the problems that happen in the country. If anything should learn the current Venezuelan leadership on how to conduct its relation with the United States, is what is done by Cuba. The relation between Cuba and the United States is improving, but also other governments, including left-wing governments, as is the case of Bolivia, Ecuador, Uruguay, Chile, Nicaragua, and some governments of small Caribbean islands, are driving to have a new positive dimension of relations with the United States. So, if there is a good relation between Cuba and the United States, if Washington has established good relations with some countries in Latin America, why Venezuela is not going to that direction? I don't know. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to, if it's okay, if you can all hear me and see me. I'm going to focus mostly, given how good a job Carlos has done in discussing Venezuela-Cuba relations, I think I'm going to focus a little bit on the US-Cuba and US-Venezuela relations, the triangle. Once again, we are in a similar scenario, those of us who study US-Latin America relations, where, if you look at the region, the United States is pretty much getting along fairly well with all countries that are doing well. It's always the countries in crisis, Venezuela being it, that always produce the most polemical moments in US-Latin America relations, and so here we go again. We're having the crisis at the moment. As a political scientist, I don't like to spend that much time on current events, but this is such an amazing current event that I cannot resist but offering some comments on what is going on in this triangle. Let me just, rather than a main point, I have several themes I would like to raise for discussion, if we have the time. First, the normalization of relations with Cuba. At first, I have to admit that I didn't love it. I think in this room we understand all the complications and contradictions associated with this policy that to me, in the beginning, looks more Cold War-ish than not, because it is an example of the United States trying to make nice with a dictatorship. I know all of that. That was my initial reaction. But I've come around and I've learned that there are many benefits. Carlos talked about those. And one of the most amazing benefits is that, of course, it disarms the Cuban government from using the anti-American card. And secondly, in the diplomatic realm, we saw the level of overwhelming support that the approach generated. We needed that. The United States needed a moment, we haven't had that since the 1990s, in which most scholars and government and even citizens in the regions were thinking that the United States was doing something positive. And I think this side effect was great. My criticism to this day about it is that I feel that the United States has come to the negotiating table too desperate for that embassy. And it has completely lost all its bargaining leverage. It's unfortunate. I think this is the mistake. It's remarkable that for a president who is so phlegmatic when it came to Cuba, it is the US side that, in my opinion, is appearing to be too eager to yield. And we're seeing the negative consequences of that. I think now we're seeing how Cuba is escalating the conditions. So that's where I am on this question. In general, I welcome it. I'm glad it's happening. It has many good effects. It is not conducted as well as I would want it, but I think there's time to introduce some fixes there. It is also interesting to discuss the domestic politics of the approach to Cuba. You live in Miami, I don't, and so you know this better. It's a very polemical issue, but most polls reveal that it is an issue that many Cuban Americans are learning to accept, and they have now switched sides and become much more favorable. Whereas, now we're going to talk about the US-Venezuela relations, the domestic constituency for US relations to Venezuela is maybe similar to the Cuban constituency maybe 30 years ago. It's more united and much more recalcitrant. So whereas the Cuban American community in Florida has split significantly, one could say that the Venezuelan community here in Florida is quite demanding of tougher actions towards Venezuela. So that's an interesting, for those of you who are interested in the domestic sources of foreign policy, you could propose writing a paper for one of my classes trying to generate a series of reflections on how these two constituencies might have played a role in these policies. Let me now say something about relations between the United States and Venezuela. I think all of us who are familiar with the decree that the White House issued recognized that there were at least two unfortunate elements to it. The first is the famous language of declaring Venezuela to be a national security threat